So I teach for the MA in Intellectual History and the History of Political Thought. Well, I wouldn't say that it's unique because several UK universities do offer comparable MAs, but I would say that it's very special. And one reason is that we have really a large group of people teaching in our MA. We have specialists in the Renaissance period, in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. Half a dozen people who can really cover the whole of the history of modern political thought in a highly expert way. And I don't think there's an MA that can compare with that, really. The other thing which is, if not unique, certainly very distinctive about this MA is the combination of the historical and the analytical. So we're doing analytical questions with the students. We talk about questions about freedom, representation, the state, political obligation, standard questions in political theory, but we approach them historically as well so that they can get some sense of the evolution of these ideas. Well, there's a core course, and that covers questions of method as well as some broader questions about political principles. And then there's a large range of modules. It's a very wide range because we draw in some support from colleges other than the two, that's to say Queen Mary and University College, which actually operate the MA. Well, I enjoy many things about it. The most obvious is that the students are very gifted. We get a really remarkable group of people. A second point is that because this is an MA which they've all chosen, they're very highly motivated, and of course that makes it a special pleasure to teach people where you don't have to keep explaining why it might matter. They already think it matters and they are already interested in it, so you can take a lot for granted and just go for it. That's also very good. And I also very much like the fact, which is far more the case here than it was in the previous university I taught in, which is that these students are very international. In fact, I think this year, I have a large class this year, I think we're 18 of us. I believe it's true, yes, it's true, that a majority of those students are not using their native language. So it's a very international group. So if you put all of that together, they're very gifted, they're very motivated, they're very international. They're all teaching and learning from each other as well. And in fact, in my group this year, they formed a little seminar group of their own. So they're learning from each other, probably much more than they're learning from me. Well, my research specialties are three, really. I'm mostly an historian by training, and my research is in early modern philosophy. So I've published books about the philosophy of Machiavelli, and I've published 3 books about the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. And I've published lots of articles in the early modern period about radical, revolutionary, leveler thought, thoughts on sovereignty, Baudin, thoughts on constitutionalism, John Locke, and so forth. So there's a strong historical component to what I do. But I'm also interested in a number of more abstract questions in political philosophy. So, for example, I've written a lot recently about the theory of the state, and I've published a book about the theory of political liberty. So questions about freedom and the state and obligation and rights, they're always at the forefront of my mind. And then thirdly, I've for a long time been interested in more philosophical questions about textual interpretation. And I've written published a book called Regarding Method, about historical method, questions in historical explanation, questions in textual analysis. Well, of course, all 3 of these interests come together and they're all reflected in the teaching that I do for the MA. At its best, well, of course, at its worst, I start something and then it doesn't work and I have to abandon it. That happens to all scholars, doesn't it? I think at its best, it depends on what I'm doing. And I suppose I've engaged in 3 kinds of research project, really. One which has been particularly rewarding is working with young scholars, usually postdoctoral scholars where we have run a big seminar, and the hope has been that we might get a book out of it. And I've run 2 of these seminars now, one about the theory of republicanism in European political speculation, and then more recently one about different views of thinking about freedom. And both of these, I have to say, were tremendous successes, and both yielded large-scale books entirely written by these young scholars. Both books, 2 volumes, both books published by the Cambridge University Press. So at its best, I think that's the best kind of relation of teaching to research one could hope for, is bringing on and trying to encourage very young scholars at the outset of their academic careers. But of course, a second kind of research which I've done collaboratively is working with colleagues on collaborative books. Professor Richard Burke, who is my closest colleague here at QM, he and I have been editing a book together in the last 2 or 3 years here at QM with a range of colleagues from the United States and from Europe and from this country on the history and the theory of popular sovereignty. So questions about the emergence and development of theories of democracy, really. And that we have just put into the press, again with Cambridge University Press. So that's another really good outcome where you bring together a major body of scholars, and you have a series of seminars which we held here at Queen Mary, which was good for our students, and they were tremendously well attended, and then a book comes out of that. But the third thing, and I suppose what I do all the time really, is I publish books and articles. And in the areas that I've talked to you about, the best that I've managed to do is some books so far on early modern political philosophy, books about Machiavelli, books about Hobbes, and I've published 3 volumes of my papers about early modern political philosophy, as well as the more abstract and philosophical books that I've mentioned. So I think if I totted them up, I must have written about, yes, I think I've written 12 books now in this area. I've been doing it for a long time. I hope it does, and I suppose that the answer to the question connects closely with what I've been trying to say about my research. My work for the MA centres on a seminar that I do on the theory of the early modern state. So we talk about the emergence of the idea of the state as the master noun of political discourse, and we talk about different ways of thinking about the state. So one of the most obvious writers then to think about would be Machiavelli, who sort of invents modern ways of thinking about statecraft. And then if you talk about Hobbes, you're talking about absolutist theories of the state. You talk about Locke, you're talking about the constitutional theory. You talk about republicanism, you're bringing things up to date. So this is what I do in my historical research, and this is what I've been publishing about in recent years. But it is absolutely the topic of my MA seminar. And so the research feeds very directly into the seminar. And that's good when it comes to the hinterland of a seminar with very gifted students. They will ask questions which arise out of the texts we're talking about, and you can get very direct questions, which really mean that it's essential that you should have got a good deal of reading all around the area. So I really like to try, and always have tried, to keep a close relationship between my research and my teaching. I think it helps both. Well, I think the school is a very good place, in part for a reason that we've talked about already, which is that we just do have a large group of people interested in intellectual history and the history of political theory in particular here at QM. I have some absolutely outstanding colleagues, and we've just recruited a very brilliant young woman, Katrina Forrester, to join us. So there's a very considerable strength, I would say, in these disciplines in the school. Another very good reason nowadays for coming to QM is that we have quite outstanding facilities in the School of History. We've got this superb new building, which is our building, and the seminar rooms are really excellent. Very good acoustics, very comfortable, the right size for different sorts of seminars or lecture halls. When we have our big public lectures associated with the MA, we can call on a really enormous an absolutely state-of-the-art lecture hall which we can fill with our visiting stars. But with the seminars, they're the right size for the kind of groups of students we have. And again, they're state-of-the-art. It's a really spectacular building in which to work. Oh, there are many advantages of coming to London. I mean, one of them is London, of course. It's just one of the most exciting cities and full of wonderful things in the cultural life of young people, people of all ages. But I think for students doing this kind of course, I would want to point to two very obvious considerations, really. One is that the University of London is enormous, and there are several colleges which take these sorts of studies extremely seriously. King's College, University College, Queen Mary, and then the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities. These are all great centres for the sorts of topics that we're talking about, and most of them run research seminars. So there's a very large number of top-notch research seminars that graduate students can go to. And then they meet each other, and then they form their own research groups. There's a large intellectual community here, much larger than you would find in any other United Kingdom university. But the second and the genuinely unique feature of being a student in London is the incomparable libraries. There are no libraries in Europe to match what we have in London. Not just because the Senate House Library of the University of London is a very major library by any standards, and it's a lending library, and students become automatically members of it, but because of the British Library. The British Library now accepts graduate students as well as undergraduate students, which means it's very crowded. But it's the largest library in Europe, and it has absolutely excellent electronic facilities as well. So all the databases are there, besides any book or periodical that you'd ever think of. And so we benefit quite extraordinarily from this unique public resource. Oh, they go in all sorts of directions. But one that is particularly important to me, obviously, as a teacher, is that from the MA, we very much recruit into our PhD programme. And since I've been at QM, I've had a considerable number of students, I think I'm up to 6 or 7 now, who have graduated from the MA and who've moved on to the PhD. And this is a very good kind of development, because one of the things that the MA enables us to do with gifted students who are thinking of continuing is to see whether this is a good idea, to see whether this works out. You get a really good chance to look at them and assess them. In fact, it's a kind of a year's interview. But in the course of that year, they're also interviewing us. They've got lots of choices, and there are other universities where they can do their PhDs. And so they're able to consider whether this would be a good plan to continue. This works very well, I think. And so what I particularly notice is not the students who go off into the media and the civil service and all the other things that they do, but the ones who stay here. And we've got a remarkable community of these people now.